Hello, and welcome to The Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the world of politics and policy through conversation. Imagine you're sitting at a dinner table with friends discussing the latest news and the impact it has on our world. That's the vibe we aim to bring to each episode. In today's fast-paced news cycle, it's easy to get lost in the details. Our goal is to step back and look at the broader trends shaping our society, from economic policies and international relations to social justice and environmental challenges. We cover it all with clarity and insight. We believe that just as it takes an array of ingredients to form a delectable dish, similarly, it takes a variety of insights and opinions to form a well-rounded perspective. Whether you're a policy wonk, a political junkie, or just someone who wants to stay informed, the Political Dispatch is your go-to source for thoughtful and engaging discussions on the issues that matter most.
My name is Lily Mott.
I'm Sid Kurapati.
And I'm Tom Spare.
And we're all master's students at Cardiff University. Between work, dissertations, and everything else in life, we'll be meeting weekly to deliver the Political Dispatch.
So each week, one of us will lead on a topic. We will look at the politics, the policy, and all the players involved. We will take a deep dive into the big issues affecting our planet, the politics, and our way of life.
Elections, AI, and the future of work, education. What are the debates driving the issues? What are the different perspectives and angles? We take you through the implications and what it might mean for you, your community, the country, and the wider world.
Before we jump into the theme for this week, we want to do a quick intro of who we are. So Lily, do you want to start off?
Yes, I can definitely start. I am Lily Mott. I am originally from Colorado in the US, but I went to school at Washington and Lee University in Virginia, very small liberal arts school. And that's where I did my undergrad. And now, as we mentioned, I am studying digital media and society at Cardiff University. So a little bit different than Tom and Sid, but we got to be in a couple modules together and we decided to bring this little project to you. So I'm super excited to be discussing lots of different issues. I think we all come with very different backgrounds and different political, I guess, kind of levels of experience in politics as well. So I think it's going to be really exciting for the three of us to have some discussions about politics. But that's enough about me. Tom, you go for it.
Hello, everyone. My name's Tom Spare. I am doing an MA in political communication at Cardiff University. So I'm sort of classmates with Lily and Sid. And my background, I grew up in Dover in the southeast of England, which was a very large majority supporting Brexit part of the world. And I moved to South Wales in 2014 after doing an undergraduate BA in politics at the University of Kent in Canterbury. So I've lived in Cardiff for 10 years, and in all that time, I've worked in higher education up until last September when I started my MA, and I've recently started a new job in the third sector, you'd say. So I've sort of moved out of the sector, but still taken interest in it. Over to you, Sid.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. My name is Sid Kurapati, short for Siddhartha Kurapati. I am from New Delhi, India. I grew up in the capital of the world's largest so-called democracy, but I did my undergrad further away from the capital in the western part of India, in a city called Pune, in business administration, after which I worked in a variety of organizations in the space of communications and content for approximately 10 years. And now I'm doing my master's in political communications at Cardiff University, where I met the amazing Tom Spare and the amazing Lily Mott. So back to you, Lily.
Yeah, this week we are going to take a look at the British general election. Voter registration closed this week, and various debates are taking place on major news and TV networks, and political memes are everywhere. I saw one today about, I guess it was a while, it's a little bit old, but it was a TikTok, and it was Nigel Farage singing like "Guess Who's Back, Back Again." So yeah, memes are everywhere, whether we want them or not. and voting takes place on the 4th of July. So I'm sure lots of Americans were, if they're politically in tune with international politics, were a little bit frustrated with that. That's supposed to be our day, but Tom is taking the lead this week. So Tom, over to you.
Okay, so the focus is going to be obviously the general election, and apologies that it was on the 4th of July, Lily. Not the first time that the British have interrupted things over on your side of the pond.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you. Mending international relations. Thank you.
Exactly, yeah. We're making a podcast together. It's fine. We're all good. Obama made plenty of jokes in his time about burning down the White House, which I always found quite fun. Also, that's my Obama point taken for today, because I usually mention him at least once a day.
Yeah, no more. That's it.
That's
no
gone,
more
yeah.
Obama. Now Sid and I both get one, though. So you can be mentioned 3 times every episode.
Okay,
That's the rule.
good. Yeah. So we're going to look at how the UK election works, and then we're going to look at what happened at the last election. We're going to look at the politics, the policies, and do a little bit of recommended reading as well, or listening if you listen to audiobooks. So let's get into the main part of it. So if we cast our minds back on the 22nd of May, Rishi Sunak, the UK's Prime Minister, called a general election. He set the voting date as Thursday, the 4th of July. In the 48 hours preceding that, his announcement, there had been a lot of speculation in the British press and social media as to whether Sunak would call the election. It came as a big surprise. Unlike in many other countries around the world, a UK general election can be called at any point by the sitting Prime Minister. This is a tradition stretching back to the very first UK elections in the 19th century. However, from 2011 to 2022, there was a law called the Fixed Term Parliaments Act that set the election to a 5-year timetable. So it became far more predictable when that election would be taking place. And if a Prime Minister wanted to call an election, they had to go to Parliament to vote for that to take place. This happened twice in that period, in 2017 and in 2019. So an election called with Parliament support in 2017 by Theresa May, and then most recently, before Rishi Sunak's call, was the 2019 general election. Today's discussion is focused purely on the general election and not really mentioning all the other elections that go on in the UK, because there are quite a lot, because we have lots of devolved administrations, which we can sort of cover a little bit, which makes the picture a lot more complicated. And we'll cover devolution throughout our discussions, I think, in whatever topics we're doing. There are a couple of steps that have to take place in order for an election to happen. First, the Prime Minister must go to the monarch, in this case, King Charles III, and request that Parliament is dissolved. So dissolved is just a fancy word of saying close for a parliamentary session to end. Members of Parliament stop being MPs, they become candidates or former MPs if they're not standing for re-election. Only the Prime Minister and government ministers retain their titles in this period. The second part is that any laws that have yet to be approved by Parliament need to be debated, dropped, or passed in what is known as the wash-up. So there was quite a lot of, because this was a very sudden announcement that Rishi Sunak made, there were quite a lot of big pieces of legislation that were meant to be going through Parliament and end up being dropped. So it's worth sort of looking into that if that interests you at all. Once Parliament is dissolved, there is a period what is known as purdah, and this is sort of the period between when Parliament is dissolved and when a new government is elected. And it's in this period that government, like civil servants, a lot of charities, other organisations can't really say anything publicly. It's a very sensitive period, so sort of heightened rules around what people can say and do. For example, the last couple of days there's been revelations about people betting on the elections within the Prime Minister's camp. So in normal times, that would be a bad thing anyway, but it's even worse. It's sort of more of a attention paid to it during an election period. So people can lose their jobs if they're sharing sensitive information. Government carries on running in that time, run by the civil servant and the ministers, but no new laws are made in that period. Third, the political parties must choose or confirm their candidates and decide in how many parts of the UK they put forward candidates. The candidate selection process varies from party to party. So if we were to look at the US system, there's sort of primaries that go on before candidates are selected. That can really vary depending on what party you're looking at. It's reported that the Conservative Party were reportedly short of candidates when the election was called, demonstrating how close-knit the decision was in Rishi Sunak's team. There are 650 seats to be won in a general election. So when a candidate wins their election, they become a member of parliament. Their job is to represent the needs of their constituency, as well as passing legislation in parliament. With each MP, they represent between 69 and 77,000 people. A constituency is a voting area, a voting district. So that's a little summary of the process. Have you guys got any questions up until that point, or any thoughts, or how it? Yeah, Sid, far away.
So interestingly, there's a lot of Indian connection to this election this year in the UK. The most famous one of them all is the Indian origin Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak. Apart from that, however, one of the things that you mentioned in your opening introduction to the topic was a particular word that you used, parda, right? The origins of that word actually goes back to India. It's got a Hindustani origin, and it has a very sexist connotation, to be very honest. But it literally means veil or like a curtain. And in India, we call it parda. So the pronunciation is marginally anglicized over here. However, it means the same thing. It also acts as a separation of the genders, and the veil was basically a separation between the men and the women back in the day. It doesn't exist as a system, officially as a system now in India, or maybe it does exist in the subcontinent, especially in Pakistan, in some areas of Pakistan, and maybe even Afghanistan to quite an extent. But in India, officially, there's no sanction for the parda anymore. But the origin of the term parda is from that. So I just wanted to add that to the dinner table conversation that we're having.
It's really cool. I didn't even know that. So well done for jumping in on that. I think we're going to find that there's going to be a lot of crossover as we sort of move through discussions on different terminology. Lily, did you have anything to add as well?
No, I think I'm caught up at this point. That is really interesting though, Sid. I didn't know that. But yeah, kind of that background is really interesting. I mean, for me, I think it's just how quick everything happens. I mean, it doesn't always happen like this, but I think when the July 4th announcement was made, I just think it was like a scramble for everyone who's involved in politics here. And I don't know how that would ever work in the US. So very interesting to be here. So I'm excited to learn more.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, in comparison to the US system where everything is every so many years, the campaign process is very long as well and costly, which I guess we'll get onto as well, general costs of general elections. So a little bit about Parliament, because we've already talked a lot about it already. In the UK Houses of Parliament, the highest law creating body is the highest law creating body in the country. There are two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. On the 4th of July, voters will be electing 650 members of the House of Commons, and to win the election, a political party must win at least 326 seats to gain a majority, and to rule by themselves without assistance from another party. Although if you have a majority of one MP and one MP rebels, then you're a bit screwed. So even if you have more than 326 MPs, you have to have quite a lot more to get any legislation, any laws passed. The party with the most winning seats becomes the government. The party with the second largest number of seats becomes the opposition. The larger the majority, the stronger a government mandate is. So if we'll talk about polls later, but the 1997 general election is a really good example of that. So when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, the government had a huge majority, and so was able to pass legislation very easily, because even if some of its sort of MPs rebelled, there was very unlikely for that government motion or those government laws to fall. And I think it was well into the 13 years that Labour was in government before they ever actually lost a vote. So it demonstrates the size of the party majority is really important. And there will be all eyes on how big Labour's majority is. There's lots of speculation as to how big they will win. I'm not convinced that they will win by the margin that a lot of the polls are suggesting. And then we can go into that. If there is a hung parliament, so if there is not a clear winner, the party with the largest number of MPs gets the opportunity to form a government with another party, either by forming a coalition or having what is called a supply and demand agreement. So a good example of a coalition was in 2010, the Conservatives were the largest party, but they didn't have enough MPs with a majority, so they formed a coalition agreement with the Liberal Democrats, even though the Liberal Democrats were the third largest party at the time. The Conservatives and Labour wouldn't have worked together because they're very different political side of things. The Labour Party had lost any sort of momentum, really, and had lost quite a lot of seats by this point. And then the supply and demand agreement is like when Theresa May didn't win as many seats as she was expecting in 2017. She got support from a Northern Irish political party. So yes, those are examples. And there's also a second chamber in the UK Parliament. So a bit like in the United States, where there is the House of Representatives and the Senate, we have the House of Lords. This is an unelected chamber. Its members either have inherited their titles, because that's the sort of country or collection of countries that we live in where inherited titles are still a thing, or they've been appointed to their role by the political parties. So the Prime Minister has the ability to appoint people to the House of Lords with the approval of the monarch, and they can either be political appointees, so they're part of the setup within government, and they can sit on the government benches, or they are crossbenchers, so they're neutral, they don't have a political party. There's also members of the House of Lords who are clergy, so bishops and the Archbishop of Canterbury have seats. The highest lawyers in the UK used to sit in the House of Lords as well, but now they sit on the Supreme Court. There are currently 784 members of the House of Lords, a big chunk of whom aren't actually that active. So they get an allowance every time they show up, but a big chunk of them are really old. They're very elderly, particularly the ones that have inherited their titles. The Commons writes the laws, and the Lords review them, and has the power to return a law if they're not happy with it. There are limitations to this, so if the law relates to money and finance, the Lords cannot reject it. And when a law goes back and forth between the two chambers, it's known as ping pong, because the thing goes back and forth. Just a little bit before I pause on the parties themselves. So the main parties, and who we'll be talking about today, are the Conservative Party, who were formed in 1834, but their origins date back to the 17th century, when they were known as the Tories. You've got the Labour Party that was formed in 1900. Plaid Cymru, who's a significant party in Wales, formed in 1925. The Scottish Nationalist Party, SNP, 1934. And then the parties after that are all relatively new. So the Liberal Democrats were formed in 1988. They were a combination of the Liberal Party, who have their sort of political ancestry dates back to the 18th century, and there were a group of rebels from the Labour Party that formed an initial group and then formed the Liberal Democrats. The Green Party were formed in 1990, and the newest member is Reform UK, that was formed in 2018, which is a sort of legacy of UKIP and Brexit party ideology, and is most famously led by Nigel Farage, who suddenly appointed himself as leader very recently in a very dramatic comeback to politics, which seems to have moved the polls along. In addition to those other parties, there's also a number of other parties of note. In Northern Ireland, there are a number of parties that hold MPs in the British Parliament. So you've got the Democratic Unionist Party, the UP, who were formed in 1971. You have Sinn Féin, who were formed in 1905. The Social Democrat and Democratic and Labour Party formed in 1970. Over in Scotland, you've also got the Alba Party, which were an offshoot from the SNP. They don't have many MPs, but it'll be interesting to see at this election whether they are successful. And they were formed in 2021 by the former SNP leader, Alex Salmond. And also in England, you've got the Workers' Party of Britain, whose only MP is George Galloway, who won in a by-election this year. Any thoughts on that so far?
Well, that's been an interesting introduction to the UK's general election system. Funnily enough, we have a very similar system back in India as well. Clearly, we borrowed it from you guys. But it's also very interesting to note that most democracies have very similar systems of an upper house and a lower house, where the lower house is elected by the people, while the upper house, in some cases, are elected by the Electoral College or titles which are transferred hereditary-wise. It's fascinating to see what has changed over the last 5 years since the last general election. I was going through a YouGov poll, and two things which coincided and which were very interesting over there was that we've seen a steady decline in the popularity of the Conservative Party, especially from roughly 2021 onwards. And the approval rating of this government is also being extremely low. Currently, according to the YouGov poll, which I'm referring to, is at 71% disapproval. And I thought that might have been the highest, but that isn't the case. Earlier this year, there was a point where the disapproval rating was at about 80% too. What has really changed? And especially this is something that we see since May 2021 onwards. And since then, they've never had a positive outlook. The people have not seen this government positively. What has changed, Tom?
Very good question. And what is quite incredible, and we can talk about the 2019 election now really, is that the 2019 general election was seen as a seismic shift in how people in the UK vote. Because generally, it was seen that the Labour Party would win cities, right? And they would win populated areas and working class areas. So famously, Wales has forever and a day been Labour. Since Labour came about, always supported Labour. For a very long time, Labour had a very big influence in Scotland, and lots of its leaders have Scottish ancestry. So if you think about Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and there's a whole raft of very notable Scottish Labour MPs. And then you've got the Conservatives, who are generally very popular in rural or wealthy areas. So even within London, the wealthiest areas will always be generally considered Conservative. 2019 brought a shift with that, and the Conservatives made considerable gains in breaking what was known as the Red Wall, this collection of constituencies, voting areas in the north of England that had forever voted Labour. And that was broken, largely driven by Brexit. So a lot of these areas were very Brexit heavy. And so suddenly the Conservatives had a very diverse coalition of different constituencies with very different needs. And so you're then having to get the support of a very broad range of people and voters. So the Conservative Party have a very elderly membership. I think in the high 60s. I think the average age, of a Conservative Party member is that age group. But then you suddenly had very working class people that had never voted Conservative in their life, choosing Conservative Party, led by Boris Johnson, who had a very wide appeal. What changed in 2021 were revelations about parties that were going on in Downing Street and elsewhere during the COVID lockdowns. And that started a whole series of issues. Over time, there's been a growing number of controversies within the government. One of the biggest was a falling out between Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, and his key sort of ally and fixer, Dominic Cummings, who had been a key proponent in them winning 2019. Dominic Cummings broke lockdown rules and used his eyesight as an excuse, it's a wild story, but he basically went on a long drive and tried to sort of cover it up, really, and came up with a lot of very bizarre reasons for it. And that started a whole trend over that time. So slowly, the confidence in the government ebbed away. So it became incredibly popular, actually, at the start of the pandemic because of a very significant government response. A lot of people criticised its speed. But over time, particularly in 2021, when these revelations came out about parties happening, it all started to descend. And it got worse and worse and worse. Johnson ended up having to resign. And then there was an election within the Conservative Party to elect a new leader. And that turned out to be Liz Truss, who had a very particular view of how things could be changed. And she wanted to hypercharge the economy because growth rates had been stagnant for a very long time. And Liz Truss ended up being Her Majesty the Queen's last Prime Minister. And one of the last things that the Queen said to her is, you need to pace yourself. Don't rush things too much. And Liz Truss did not listen to that advice. And she proceeded to make a load of actions which got the markets very scared, and the economy went into freefall due to some quite technical bonds that the Bank of England had, the gilt market, and it then led to a huge spike in costs across the board, and ended up in the situation where we're only just seeing inflation lowering to 2% this month.
It's interesting you mention how the downfall kind of started from Boris Johnson's parties and has now transitioned to what we have today. Having said that, yet another poll on YouGov taken during the first quarter of 2024, where it checks who's the most popular conservative politician, Boris Johnson tops the list. Ironic, isn't it? And do you know where the current Prime Minister is sitting on that list? Take a guess.
Bottom, probably, actually.
No, well, he's not at the bottom. There are 20 of them. He's not on the bottom for sure. No, interestingly.
There we go.
He's on number 13.
Oh, okay. Out of who's at the bottom?
Tom Tugendhat.
Oh, yeah, okay. So, is this out of all of the?
Yeah, out of 20 of them.
Okay.
So you have Boris Johnson topping the list at 30%. Then you have Penny Mordaunt at 26%. Shane would be very happy to know that Sir John Major is on third position at 24%.
Oh, excellent.
And then so on. Even Suella Braverman is more popular than Rishi Sunak at 24%. I don't know how that works out, but yeah, that's what YouGov says. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if any sitting prime minister has had such low popularity, even within his or her own party. It's definitely a very different kind of election where everybody thinks that the Labour is going to be winning it. All one is speculating is that by how much.
Yeah, well, yeah, this is the thing. And a lot of people are making the argument of, are the results being driven by politics or the polls? And I was listening to a few podcasts that are questioning the same thing. Yeah. And any thoughts with it?
I have another question because I think the biggest, as I've started to learn more about like British politics and just the way that the system works, I think it's so interesting because a criticism that I've heard this election cycle has been how similar Labour and Conservative their manifestos are at this point, and just how kind of close they've gotten. So they've both kind of drifted into the middle. And some of the people that I've spoken with in my youth mobilization efforts have just been really frustrated with how Labour has conceded to a lot of policy points that maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they would not have stood for. And so then I think that's going to lead a lot of young people to either spoil their ballots or to vote green, and just go a different way. I just want to get your thoughts on the way that the actual system itself is kind of set up to do that. You know, I think it's set up where there is this fluidity for parties and they can kind of jump between policy points and merge to one another. And that's actually in their interest. You know, it's actually in their interest to kind of position themselves sometimes closer to another party, like you were talking about with coalition forming and things. What's your take on that? Because I just think it's so interesting the way that the system changes so much and a party could be entirely different, even like the next election cycle than it is this year. But yeah, I guess that's not really a question. I just want your general thoughts on that as like a political system, I guess.
Yeah, it's a very it's I think it's frustrating for a lot of people because they want, given where the economy is and where we are environmentally, there were a lot more hopes, I think, that the Labour government would be more radical in its approach. And actually, out of all of the manifestos that have been launched, Labour's is the most conservative of a small c. You know, its ambitions are quite limited because they're basically saying we've fully costed this manifesto and we can't go beyond this point. And the reason why they've done that is that in 2019, it was perceived that Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto was wildly ambitious and not costed. And this is the accusation that's made against Labour again and again, that it spends the money and the Conservatives are the ones that come and save the day. But in this case, it's going to be the reverse, that the Labour government are most likely going to be one of the most conservative Labour governments that we've ever had, because of the spending constraints. And so you've got the current Conservative government being a lot more, spending a lot, making a lot more commitments, but they sort of know they're not going to win. So they're trying to retain their base. What's been really interesting, as you mentioned, the Greens, is I think the Green Party is going to start to make more of a foothold in our political life. They currently have one MP. They have quite a few local councillors, but it's likely they're going to win 2 or 3 MPs, one of which will be in Bristol, in the May constituency in the middle of Bristol, which is a left-leaning city, got a big university city. And when Black Lives Matters really became prominent in the UK after the murder of George Floyd, Bristol was leading the way in terms of anti-racism movements, and Bristol has a long history with slavery and prominent sort of slave owners from that time. Their statues were removed and various other things like that. So yeah, I think the Green Party could potentially mop up a lot of youth disenchantment with Labour, and also the Liberal Democrats are benefiting. And I was really surprised how radical the Liberal Democrats' commitments have been, and their commitment to the NHS, their commitment to social care. Their leader, Ed Davey, is actually a carer himself. His son is disabled and his wife has MS. So they're sort of leading the way there. Yeah, and I think Labour's being advised, and Keir Starmer's being advised by a lot of former Tony Blair era advisors, basically, and former MPs who are telling him to be cautious because the Conservatives, despite their current situation, are one of the most electorally successful political parties in the Western world, and they have a tendency to bounce back quite quickly. So and I think I was doing some stats on this. Since 1928, the Conservatives have won 56% of the elections, so they're a little bit ahead. Yeah, does that cover everything, do you think?
Oh yeah. It wasn't even really, I think it's so interesting the way that this system lends itself to so much fluidity, which can be a really good thing. But I think there's so much frustration tied in that because there's no need for a party to really stand its ground on anything, which is, there's no real like party identity at any time. So I think it's just really interesting the way that it can change so much, which can be a really good thing. I think it's better than a stagnant system where nothing gets done. But it can also be frustrating when you want a party that stands firmly on an issue or on their manifesto that they promise. So it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Sid?
I think I just wanted to build on what you were saying, but from a different perspective. I think the US went through something similar when Donald Trump was elected in 2016. And then when the 2020 elections, and of course, Lily might be able to better explain this, but by the time 2020 elections happened, you kind of knew that Biden will win the election, and most of the polls were kind of favoring him. And he ended up winning, and he had a decent majority and whatnot. And all that happened on January 6th happened. However, it's not a lot of the voters who voted for Democrats were thinking that there's going to be a sudden shift in the economy and things are going to be amazing, and all the things that have changed in the last 4 years will be rectified and whatnot. I feel that there is a voter disillusionment that is happening around the world, where people think that a more liberal sort of a democratic party, when it comes back to power after a conservative party has been in power, it sort of rectifies all the wrongs or the things that have been lacking so far in the last term or so. But I think there's going to be a lot of disappointment, even though Labour is going to be winning a record margin of seats this year. At least that's what the polls say. But I think after the end of the term, after 6 years or so, I think there's going to be a fair amount of discontentment, I would say, among the voters, that they will see that a few policies just can't be changed. Few changes cannot be reversed. What do you think about that, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, my prediction is this Labour government, and I'm happy to be wrong here, but I think the Labour government's only going to last one term. And I think the reason for that is Labour is basically in exactly the same position that the Conservatives were in 2019, although they're in a weaker position than they were. Although they're in a weaker position than the Conservatives were in 2019, because actually Boris Johnson sacked or got rid of a load of Conservative MPs that rebelled against him, including Winston Churchill's grandson, and basically said, "Oh, we're having a general election," because he got rid of a load of people. The number of MPs that they had was close to zero in terms of a majority, so he had to go for an election. And I think Labour are going to struggle because they're going to have a very big coalition of very different voters that are going to be incredibly difficult to satisfy. And if Labour have the majority, so if we were to look at the Ipsos Mori poll where they're getting, I don't know, like 400 plus MPs, you've got a lot of MPs to satisfy too. Half of all new MPs in Parliament will be brand new. They will be very new to the political system. They will make mistakes because they are brand new. Because there's going to be so many MPs, there's not going to be enough ministerial jobs to keep people satisfied. And a lot of people aren't voting because they believe in Labour, they're voting because they don't like the Conservatives. And it's the same situation with Biden. They voted for Biden because he wasn't Donald Trump. And, you know, political electorates' memories are very short. And a lot of people see it as, you know, when Donald Trump was president, the world wasn't in multiple wars, the economy was much better, all of this sort of stuff. So I think it's reflective of that too. Unless, you know, Labour come in and surprise us all. But the reality is they've signed up to the Conservative commitments on spending. There's going to be a really tight squeeze on government spending, and people's lives aren't going to get better. And if your life isn't better, it's like the Ronald Reagan thing is, you know, is your life better than it was 5 years ago? If it's not, vote for me. Yeah, that's my take on it.
What would you say about that, Lily? The analogy of shift in, you know, voter expectations, you know, when you're comparing UK and the US, because you know the system better.
I think that is very true. I hadn't really thought about it like that, where I think people are voting for the lesser of the two evils right now. But like you said, I think after people don't have to do that, and if there's another option that comes down the line in a couple of years, they're going to jump for that. It's just interesting because I think the US right now is in this different situation where now nothing else has arisen. And so I wonder if the UK is also going to be in that stalemate where it's like, okay, we chose the lesser of the two evils and now it's still the two evils. And then I wonder what will happen, because I mean, that's what we're going to be looking at in November. You know, it's okay, we didn't really want Biden that much the first time, but we certainly didn't want Trump. But now that we have the same two options and one is now a felon and the other one is over 80 years old, where do we go from here? You know, it's just tricky because I think everyone was optimistic about there being another option. But I feel like unless there's some changes in UK politics and maybe in like the world order in the next few years, it might be something similar where Labour and Conservative just kind of stay together in this middle area and there's not that much shifting. But what do you think about that, Tom?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's on a bit of a knife edge, really, because, you know, although Biden won by a big majority, you know, he got the most votes in history in the US. Donald Trump got the second most votes in history. So it's not like, you know, he won by a decent amount, but because of the way the voting system works in the US by the electoral, the college vote, it's like the electoral college. Like Biden only won by sort of several, like 20,000 votes or something like that. I can't remember the exact number, but it's definitely less than 40,000. So it's actually quite close. And what might happen is it might go one of two ways in America. It might go that Biden wins the popular vote and Trump wins the electoral college, or vice versa. So, you know, you've got this thing where it's going to be very tight in the UK system. So going back to sort of explaining the process, the UK has a first past the post system, which means if you have a constituency and you are voting and you have a choice of candidates, you can only vote once, and you put an X next to that person, or cross or tick next to that person's name. All the votes are added up, and it is the person with the most votes wins, you know, +1 basically. So, you know, 50% +1 is you win. So if a candidate gets 21,000 votes and the second person gets 19,999, the first person wins, you know, the one with the most votes wins. But the way in which the constituencies work across the UK, it's become very unpredictable. And a lot of that is because of devolution in the UK. So you've got parliaments in Scotland and in Wales, and you've got the setup in Northern Ireland. So there's lots of tiers of government responsible for different things. In England, you've got the mayors, very powerful mayors in London and in Midlands, in the north of England as well. And you've got very different political setups, for example, in Scotland, where you've got the Scottish Nationalist Party, or in Wales, you've got the Labour Party and the Conservatives, but you also have applied. So it's very fragmented, and it's become more fragmented in the last 25 years since devolution. Lily, any?
I think you're right. I do think if something happens with a split between the Electoral College and the popular vote, that definitely will lead to like a Supreme Court challenge. I mean, there's already lots of discussion about how people are frustrated with representation, and they're frustrated with the Electoral College system already. And we already saw that with Al Gore and Bush, and then we saw it again with Clinton. And now it's like, if this happens again, I mean, I think that the system, there's a lot that could be fixed with it. And I think if it happens again, it's going to be like, okay, all right, there needs to be some challenge here. But that will be really interesting if that happens. I think that's going to cause some shifting in the US for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And there's been lots of discussion, hasn't there, about changing the way in which the votes work, and obviously as well, it's down to the states how they organise their political setup too, in terms of the voting process and having postal votes and all of that sort of stuff. What I found quite fascinating is that Trump was sort of undermining the electoral process, and actual fact probably lost a lot of votes for claiming that it was, undemocratic, or and actually if he'd kept his mouth stum, he probably would have won. But Donald Trump's not famous for
that's what's so interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it drives me nuts, because if you look at the Electoral College and you think about a state like Wyoming, for example, like the population of Wyoming and the influence that they have on American politics is crazy. And a lot of those states that are less populated lean conservative and have historically leaned conservative. So it's just such an interesting thing. You're so right. Trump kind of, with him questioning the vote and the electoral system, it's like, okay, bud, all right.
Right. Okay, cool. So I guess there's a couple more things I can mention, really. Is we've talked about the polls, and you made reference to them, Sid. What is quite incredible is how consistent they've been over the last 6 months and how little they've budged. So Labour's been sitting on between 40 and 44% for that whole time. And the Conservatives had a little boost when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister in September 2021. But since then, it's been in pretty much terminal decline. And basically what Rishi Sunak was hoping for, I think, was a replication of what Labour did in 2017, where actually mirror image. So the Conservatives won in the in the low 40s approval ratings in the polls, and Labour was on around a similar amount, 22, 23. And in the end, the Labour Party gained 10% in approvals and was able to leave Theresa May without a majority. I think he was hoping for that boost. That boost never came. My thinking on it is he called the election. From a cynical point of view, is that when the election's over, he can then put his girls into a Californian school, because that's when the term times line up. So he's going to become a tech bro in California, and he's got a whole life sort for himself out there. There's also the other factor that a lot of people wanting to get rid of him, and I think he jumped before people could stab him in the back. Because he didn't need to call the election until early January 2025. So that's something to consider. And Reform UK have really gone up the polls since Nigel Farage has become leader of the party, where he appointed himself, which is not very democratic, but there we go. And yeah, any other thoughts about the leaders of the different parties or anything?
No, I think it's going to be very interesting. Of course, if the Labour wins, it's going to be Keir Starmer who's going to be the Prime Minister. However, it'll be very interesting to see who's going to be the leader of the opposition, because it's definitely not going to be Rishi Sunak, because he doesn't have the kind of popularity in his party anyway. So he's either going to be a backbencher, or as Tom likes to call it, he's just taking his private jet to California, the state of California. So a little Arnold Schwarzenegger reference there, if the listeners didn't get it.
Welcome to California. When Arnie was governor of California and married to a Kennedy as well.
Yeah, that's true. But transitioning from the popularity of leaders and the polls, I would like to go into the policy side of things, which I find very interesting. And it's quite right what Lily said earlier, that the both are kind of merging together now. It's like a bad marriage that's which is going further stale, and there's not really much of a difference between the two partners in it. But one of the things which I thought was very interesting was that was the whole the scheme to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda, and that they're going to have more regular flights to Rwanda. And according to one BBC article, which scrutinizes rather the policies in each party manifesto, the author over there calculated that official figures, and I'm quoting here, official figures show that sending 300 people will mean the UK would have to pay Rwanda £541 million over 5 years, or 1.8 million pounds per transferred individual. Considering the state of the economy, where the hell are they finding this money? And wouldn't it have been cheaper for them to actually keep the people in the UK than spend 1.8 million per individual? That's like a lot of money. I don't mean, I definitely am not being politically correct when I say that this seems more like a charity scheme for Rwanda. No offense to Rwanda, though. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even the president of Rwanda was getting annoyed. In the end, you're saying, I'm actually happy to give the money back, because it's caused, it's not a good look for him. And what was, I think, most amazing out of the Rwanda situation is the government passing legislation, or attempting to pass legislation, that basically made Rwanda a safe country in writing, which is the most bizarre thing you can do. So there was the question to say, and this is the whole thing about, with immigration, is you've got to prove that the place that you're sending those people to is safe. And by lots of measures, Rwanda isn't. There has been incredible amount of progress in Rwanda in the last sort of 30 years in so many ways. But this president has been president for a very long time. Its human rights record isn't great, and the cost is astronomical. It's not a humane sort of approach to be taking, really. And Rishi Sunak's wasted so much political capital on it, and sort of planted his flag to that mast, come what may. And it's right that with that money, he could have done so many different things. I mean, he could have recruited a lot of border control, for example. He could have, streamlined the process, or recruited more people behind the scenes to process the number of applicants that have come through. And I think yesterday there was just over 800 people that crossed the channel in one day on 12 boats. And having grown up in Dover, where that's happening, that's a very visual thing. You can see, you can see that where there's been a lot of scaremongering in Dover, where people claim, oh, there's illegal immigrants are running through my garden, and in some cases there were actually people, in a small number of cases, where they'd managed to get onto land and then were just running around loose. But part of the problem is that our immigration levels have gone up because we left the European Union, and we're our controls of the borders have gone wrong because we're no longer part of that bigger club. On top of that money that we're spending on Rwanda, we're paying the French government hundreds of millions of pounds, tens of millions of pounds, I don't know the exact figure, to keep the, to increase border checks and to increase security along there, and retrieving people in the channel. Where does the money come from is a very good question. And there's a great Tony Benn quote, which is, if we can afford to bomb people, we can afford to help people. And the same applies to this situation. If we can afford to extradite people, we can afford to help people.
I think that is so well said. That is, I think when I've been learning about this, it almost seems like a joke. It's like almost like the border wall. The fact that this would even be considered, let alone actual policy, is outrageous. I just think the human rights of the situation and everything about it, like you were saying, if there's money in the budget, put it somewhere where it will actually help. I think you're right too, Tom, about the fallout from Brexit, and when you think about immigration numbers as well, a lot of people immigrated when they had to become official immigrants when they wouldn't have had to because they were citizens of the EU before. So it's so interesting because I think that there's a lot of fear mongering where it's like, let's look at the actual data and see where this is all actually coming from, because I think it is just a tactic. But yeah, that's really interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, Sid. That's an interesting topic.
One thing which I wanted to add to this was that I feel that sometimes political parties, when they are very desperate, tend to bring in policies which are aimed at optics and are aimed at appeasing the ultra-right or the ultra-left, whichever party is in power. This is one of those. But interestingly enough, according to a poll in YouGov dated 29 to 30th May, it says that immigration and asylum is the fourth most important important issue for Britons based on which they're going to be voting in this election. And that's huge. And it's pretty close to the third most one, which is the economy in general, how the economy has been performing. The first, of course, is the cost of living crisis, which is really fueling the labor's return. But immigration is a very important issue for a lot of people in the UK. And I think what the Conservative Party is trying to do is that they are trying to offset all those voters who were probably going to leave the Conservative Party in favor of the Reform UK because they are far more radical than the Conservative Party, and kind of retain them as much as possible. And in India, we had similar situation where in 2019, just after the elections had happened and the BJP came back to power, the government passed two very controversial bills. And the famous one was the Citizenship Amendment Act, which basically alienated 2 or 3 religions, barring all others, from getting Indian citizenship from the rest of the countries in the subcontinent. 5 years have passed since then, and the total number of people who benefited from that amendment, which is a constitutional amendment that they passed, in a country like India, in one of the most populated regions, the number is 24. So there's a lot of optics to it. And of course, there was a lot of protests against that discriminatory act. But at the end of the day, it's just 24 people that have benefited from that to date. And probably there'll be more, but it's not going to probably pass more than 2,000 people. And when it comes to a country like India, 2,000 doesn't make really much of a difference. Similarly, a country like the UK, which has a population roughly around 60 million, and you have immigrants pouring in, I'm sure they are. Sending 300 immigrants, illegal immigrants, so to speak, to Rwanda, I mean, that's hardly a number, right? But that's coming at a very high cost. And I hope people sort of open their eyes and sort of read. I found this out literally in 30 minutes. That's all you need, 30 minutes, and you'll find out this information. And that would clearly tell you, okay, what's the reality of a particular policy. So yeah, I just wanted to add that point to it.
Yeah, I mean, immigration is always a big topic. I can't really think of many politicians, frontline politicians at the top of government or opposition, that have been big advocates for immigration in the UK. And I always think back to the Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Brown, which is a very famous speech that he made in the 1960s. Okay, yeah, 1968 Rivers of Blood speech. by a conservative politician called Enoch Powell. And basically, it was his response to immigration that had been happening since the Second World War, where immigration had been coming from what then the former empire, now Commonwealth, from the West Indies, from India, from various countries around the world. And he was basically saying that the life of white people in Britain was under threat, and it would soon be people of color that would be dominating the population. And it was a complete scare tactic, because even now the population of the UK is 92% ethnically white. It's the numbers and everything just don't add up, and this is part of the problem. And I really wish that basically my thoughts on it are, there has never been a positive response to rivers, as in like a rebuttal fully to the rivers of blood speech. So it sort of always hangs in the air, and you get this thing, and I just, it really boggles my mind when people are interviewed on the streets. And I don't like vox pops, and we've learned a lot about it on our course, where it's just lazy journalism, where you're asking a market town in the middle of England at midday on a Thursday what people's opinions are. And the only people that are going to be about are kids skiving off school, so they're not going to be on TV, the unemployed, or the elderly. And that's not really a good reflection of what's going on in wider society. But even still, there are people that would say, I'm not racist, but. And I still can't believe that people still say this, that it's like that there's still this sort of feeling, and resentment. And Brexit was a really key part of it. Very misleading information about Turkey joining the EU, and look at all these Muslims that are coming through. And it's the same rhetoric that Trump's used. And it's been reflected in France. It'll be interesting to see what the results will be in the French parliamentary elections with Marine Le Pen and her party too. It's just a constant that's used across so many of the right, and it just doesn't seem like centre parties or leftist parties have much of an answer for it. Really, they're almost always trying to appease those voters because they need them, and so they will never be radical in their response because they need those centre-right, right-wing voters.
I do think it's really interesting because as we're talking about all of the different countries' immigration policies, I wonder, I guess just taking it even broader, I think this is a reflection of a global trend right now of just isolationism, but I think it comes from this power vortex where I think since the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the US kind of emerged as this world leader and took it in its own hands to provide security for the rest of the world. And now that that's dissolving a bit, and I think that we're starting to see that with the lack of action in the Israel-Palestine conflict and the lack of action in Ukraine. And now I think that there's this concerning trend where the rest of the world is deciding to turn into itself, and so is the United States. But now we're starting to see, I think, immigration policy becoming stricter because of that trend as well. It's like security, it's immigration, it's just all of this tied up into let's close our borders, let's stay into ourselves. And more than half of the world's population is going to the ballot box. It's just this time of political chaos in so many ways. So I just wonder how we're going to come out of it. But that's on a very macro level, just lots of scary questions for the future. But yeah.
Yeah, and lots to discuss as well, in future podcasts. I know, Sid, you're keen on talking about the number of elections that there are sort of taking place across the world at the moment. And, most recently in South Africa, there's been significant shift in voter trends. In France, I think we'll see it too. In Poland, there was a sort of recovery of centrist politics, but how long that holds for beyond Donald Tusk, we don't really know. And in the UK too, it's a very unpredictable sort of situation. And the President Erdogan of Turkey there's a quote that he said, and it's something on the lines of, democracy is like a tram. It gets you to where you need to get to, and then you get off. And that's the sort of view of a lot of the strong men that exist across the world. You know, Trump has been part of that. Bolsonaro in Brazil, who replicated, you know, an attempt on rebelling against the result and riots in a similar way that Trump supporters did during, you know, the riots in the Capitol building. And there are lots of other examples. President Putin. I saw. I think I shared in the our WhatsApp group today a photo of the president of North Korea and President Putin driving a van together, and it's bizarre, you know. And they're supplying each other with weapons. Iran as well, you know, and yeah, it's quite incredible that you have these big characters who will just outwit the functioning of democracy, and they present very clearly, you know, these democracies don't work. And there's actually really worrying survey results where under 35s, in a chunk of, you know, only about 57% of people under the age of 35 believe that democracy is the best way to go. And this is a really big problem. And to keep going back to France, you know, there's a rising number of young people in France that are supporting right-wing political groups as well. So this isn't just an old person thing. This is, you know, this is a wider thing that's going on.
I'd like to add a few points here. Firstly, Putin was driving a limo of a Russian state-made car called Oris, and wasn't a van. It's a really fancy limo, by the way. You should check it out. Heavily armored. You know, it's got all the things that James Bond would have. And secondly, it's true. You have a lot of younger people choosing to support far right or right wing politics, or right wing style of democracy or autocracy, as you know, some of the institutions call it. But interestingly enough, over the last 6-7 months or so, where major countries have had a lot of elections, you've also seen the rise of the centrists and also of the left. You know, Bolsonaro lost the election, and Lula da Silva came back to power, and he is a huge proponent of workers' rights and, you know, belongs to the center left. Similarly, Erdogan lost the election in Turkey, and in South Africa, the African National Congress, which has had a majority since the end of apartheid and since Nelson Mandela, is the first time that they've lost majority. And a lot of people even consider the fact that, hey, they probably lost track of what they were supposed to do. And now they're in coalition with a new party, which is called the DAC. And similarly, in India, you've had right-wing hate politics that have actually been, you know, the influence of it has actually come down now. Well, I wouldn't say the influence has come down. I would say the impact of it is far less, because people have voted for a much better opposition in India. And it's the rise of the center left, definitely, and a coalition of parties which have similar ideologies, at least, or varying degrees of center left and center right, which is very interesting to see, because world over, you do have a very steady rise of right-wing politics. And UK is going to see the rise of the center left too, with the Labour coming back to power in all probability, if we have to believe polls. Iñaki, however, would have told us not to believe in polls at all. Iñaki is our professor who taught us electoral behavior and who really scrutinized the whole idea of opinion polls being absolutely rubbish. Yeah, that's something which I definitely wanted to add. And I think in this particular election, more than policy issues, it's just definitely going to be party loyalty that's going to make a difference, where people are going to be like, yeah, I'm just going to go vote for Labour. And while policies are roughly similar, I don't know how either of the parties is going to handle the cost of living crisis, which is the most important issue that is there.
I think that the Labour Party have courted business like no other Labour Party. And I would argue whether this Labour Party is left-wing of any nature. I think it's a very, very centrist and centre-right party. What's interesting is that in my dissertation research, I'm looking at the representation of Generation Z in Wales and the nature of the media ecosystem that exists in Wales. And the fact is that, newspaper readership, actual physical newspaper readership, the average age of a newspaper reader is 64 years old. So what you get in the media is a presentation of a particular worldview. And when I was listening to News Agents, the podcast, they were saying how in Australia, Murdoch owns 68% of news outlets in Australia. So when the election came along and the left-wing government won, Albanese's government won, everyone was very surprised. The commentariat were very surprised that this had happened. And I think this election will be the last one where older voters still have the same impact. I think the next general election that happens in the UK, I think we will see far more influence of younger folks, because I think the tides are shifting. I might be wrong, and it could just be the same as ever. But the population of the news readership and also the political parties is very elderly, and it doesn't seem that Labour are offering much of a radical option. They've literally committed to the same spending regime as the Conservative Party. They're upping spending on defence. They're putting out these very clear messages on law and order, being tough on immigration. They've ruled out carrying on Rwanda, but I think they're going to be pretty, they're recruiting more police officers, they're recruiting more teachers. This is bread and butter. But my fear is it's a 20th century solution to 21st century problems. This is pretty much just trying to copy and paste of what was going on in the late 90s, and the whole political structure is entirely different. Voters are far more unpredictable, and Naki is right to complain about the accuracy of polls, because they're not good enough to determine the fact that maybe up to 40% of the UK electorate still hasn't made its mind up on who it's going to vote for. And actually, maybe we are over-professionalizing the idea of how a voter votes. And it might just be the very fact that someone will turn up and vote on the day and not really know who they're voting for when they walk into that polling booth. And they look at a name and they might just pick it at random, or go, I'll just pick it safe and I'll pick Labour or whatever, I don't think there is as much of an art form to the general public as a lot of people in the general media environment claim.
So as far as your reading and your information ecosystem that you're consuming right now, give us some recommendations as we head into the election on July 4th. What are you reading? What would you recommend to anyone who's listening, especially if they're not that familiar with the British election system?
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So an audio book that I still need to finish, but is very good, is Why Is This Lying Bastard Lying to Me? By Rob Burley. And it's all about, he worked in political programming all of his career. And it's absolutely brilliant dissection of how the media interacts with politicians and how disingenuous politicians are. It starts with recounting the time which Boris Johnson, sometimes they're difficult to tell the difference, where Boris Johnson hid in a fridge to escape media scrutiny. He also talks of a time when he was preparing the notes for Richard Dimbleby, one of the famous Dimbleby brothers, in interviewing Paddy Ashdown, who was the Liberal Democrat leader. And basically, Rob, who was very young at the time, was the researcher and found some questioning of the Lib Dem manifesto, and Richard Dimbleby was able to pick out these massive flaws in the manifesto. Paddy Ashdown responded by saying, "You've got that entirely wrong. I know this manifesto back to front, and I've written it." Afterwards, some drinks afterwards, Paddy Ashdown was joking to everyone. He said, "Of course I knew those numbers were wrong, but I wasn't going to admit it on national television." So you've got this, the presentation of what politicians are, and it's a really fascinating dive into everything. In terms of how we got here, All Out War is a really brilliant book by Tim Shipman. Its full title is All Out War, the full story of how Brexit sank Britain's political class. It's a really, really good book. It's pretty hefty, but again, available audiobook. And if you want a wider picture of how we've, to the wider political system, Andrew Marr's books are very good. And he's done lots of TV series as well on this. The History of Modern Britain is a really excellent book. And I appreciate that's all men there, but a lot of the people that write about British politics in particular seem to be men, unfortunately, and hopefully I can do a bit more research and find a more diverse group of authors.
We'll link all of those in the description of the episode too, so that'll be perfect, and you can check those out. And I think that brings us to the end of episode 1 of the Political Dispatch. Thank you, Tom. That was great.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, for leading this episode. It was quite insightful, and it was a very engaging conversation.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, guys. I really, really enjoyed it. Big thank you to Lily and Sid for the great discussion that we've had today.
Instead of having a discussion next week, since we've had a fairly long discussion today in this episode, we're going to have an episode coming up post the election, and it's going to be a post-election analysis with Lily and Tom and myself, of course. And in the meantime, of course, Lily, would you like to take it away?
Of course. In the meantime, we would really appreciate if you could subscribe to the podcast. We would also love to hear your thoughts and your feedback on everything that we talked about today. So please leave us a rating or a comment wherever you're listening to this podcast now. We would really appreciate that.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next time.